The central feature of Lippmann photography, which is not shared by holography, is that when light is reflected off of a reflecting surface, the individual wave groups interfere with their own reflection. So coherence, as such, is merely a question of whether the incoming wave will cohere with its reflection at the reflective boundary. What this does, if the recording medium is sitting on the surface of a mirror, it means, quite simply, that the phase history of the incoming light doesn't really matter very much, and as a result, partially coherent light can be used for such an imaging process. It is greatly less restrictive than the technique of holography. When one considers the geometry of Lippmann processes, the incoming light arriving at some angle onto the recording medium is refracted and then reflected off the reflective support down here, and the pitch of that reflected layer depends on the angle of incidence quite clearly, but rather weakly. And a very important point to observe with the recording of Lippmann effects is that the refractive index of the recording material has the effect of bending the waves towards normality and hence producing stronger interference and also a reduced range of angles of incidence than would otherwise be the case. There's a very important feature of holography, in fact, that the recording medium tends to actually attract the light into it in such a way as to enhance the interference process. It's sometimes overlooked. Without that, I think many of the regimes simply wouldn't work at all. But the sensitivity to changes of angle of incidence is not too great, which means that the process may be reasonably tolerant. Now, this diagram will be recognized by our distinguished Russian visitor, since it comes from his book, and shows how the standing wave patterns depend on the wavelength of light, and how if, in fact, they're superposed from different colors, then inevitably what one gets is a pattern with strong contrast near the reflective surface, but which fizzles out to virtually nothing as one moves away from the surface of the reflector. So if one is attempting to use different colors of light in a sequential recording process, it's not unlikely to be simultaneous, then one has to choose those colors carefully. And also there's the question of the bandwidth associated with each color. There are restrictions imposed, therefore, by chromatic bandwidth, and those really have to be considered. They can obviously be considered by computational methods or just pure empiricism by just having a look-see. But of course what this does tell you is that the bonding of the recording material to the mirror is a critical aspect of Lippmann photography, and getting that mirror in contact with the recording material is one of the tricky parts of the whole exercise. In fact, many people would be making good quality Lippmann photographs were it not for the sheer difficulty of connecting the photographic emulsion to the mirror at the back of the recording process. I'll show you later how we solve that problem. Just to remind you then, if we come to the classic reflection hologram example here of Denisyuk, the standing wave patterns that one gets are complex. They're not locked into position by the presence of any mirror. Their spatial disposition is arranged according to the shape and distance of the object that is being recorded. Now what this does, it means that for holography, unlike photography, the phase space of the recording medium can easily be used up. So if the object is very complex and the fringe structures from each elemental part of the object have many details, so there are many partial wave structures being recorded, it's quite easy to overload the recording medium. And people working in the subject of holography know only too well that diffuse objects have a very severe problem in this context. So generally, at the back of the problems of recording Lippmann photographs or Lippmann holograms in general is the concept of having an object which has a well-defined form, but which is not so defined by being very diffuse that the complexity of the waves that one is trying to record overload the recording medium. And so usually people working in holography are very careful to choose the object carefully. And if you look at some of the great Soviet holograms, well, many of them come from reflective treasures from the great museums. In Professor Kubota's examples, the doll has a nice shiny surface, but there's enough pigmentation and diffusion to give you a sensation of form, and so you can understand where the doll actually is in space. So this question of perception of form of a three-dimensional structure is never so important as in the case of interference photography or interference holography. Both of these subjects make stringent demands. In order to see what the limitations of Lippmann photography are, one can perform very simple experiments. And these we've done on a variety of occasions, taking a disk of sodium light over here fed through a diffuser and the recording medium and its mirror backing, which is not shown in the diagram. Here's the mirror again at the back. And we've arranged to look at the F number of the imaging experiment. This is just the same as the F number of an ordinary photography experiment, on the basis that if we take a larger and larger disk here, the range of angles of arriving light arriving on the recording medium increases, and eventually we might expect to overload the recording medium for reasons I've outlined earlier. So the question of whether there is, in fact, an F number below which you should not go is endemic to all problems of this nature. It's important in Lippmann photography. It's especially important in holography, where if the object is a large, white, diffuse surface, eventually, as the size is increased, thereby reducing the F number, the system simply fails to record properly. So this experiment was an interesting one to perform, and it yielded results, very promising results, with the techniques which I'm going to outline throughout the course of this talk, with probably something like a criterion of that sort of order imposed. So this is a really rather relaxed criterion for any form of recording system. It surprised us because we thought that the F number limitations might be very severe, but they're not. So we're looking at a pretty relaxed kind of recording procedure. Anyway, a diffuse sodium disk, a recording medium made up this way, will produce very effective Lippmann reflectors. We substituted this sodium source here for filtered natural light coming from a tungsten halogen source, and the results were very similar. Now, how that's done will gradually become clear as we go through the various aspects of the technology. But because we're able to get similar reflective effects in the recording using either sodium or the reflection of filtered white light, we presumed really there will be no serious problems in moving into polychromatic conditions at a later date. So again, if we just look at this experiment again, sodium source is put behind an aperture, and we just, I think there's a duplicated diagram, I apologize for that. But anyway, this is the point, that in all imaging techniques of this type, the F number must be considered as limiting the actual performance of the experiment. It's no good trying to push the F number down too far. The system simply won't work. So here we see the interesting mix of geometrical and physical optics which is bound up in Lippmann photography. For an object outside the lens here, the rays from the object arrive on the imaging medium over here on the right at a range of angles. And the angles that the rays arrive at determine the fringe patterns that are recorded in the recording medium. So angle and wavelength are related in the context of recording. If the light comes in at an extreme angle at a given color, it will be seen as a different color if viewed head on. So if one looks at the band of spatial frequencies involved by having the light coming in over an angular range defined as in this diagram, one very easily generates some form of criterion in which the thickness of the recording material, the height of the image, the F number of the imaging system, the refractive index of the recording medium, the wavelength in air, and the diameter of the imaging system there come into the arena. And so therefore, the mixing of the physical and geometrical optics comes about by simply imposing the demand that the range of spatial frequencies of the recorded pattern is not excessive, otherwise that will cause a blurring of the image on the grounds that I proposed earlier, looking at Professor Denisyuk's simple diagram of the mixing of colors. So when you're mixing colors, there's a chromatic bandwidth limitation, but if you start mixing angles, there's an angular bandwidth limitation as well, in which color and angle become intimately mixed up with each other. So this is one of the complexities of this sort of photography. This criterion then is sort of basic. It shows you how the physical and geometrical optics are linked by the process. In considering the perception of the form of an object, we start to get into the difficulties which are posed by imaging real objects in the Lippmann photography case. A small source of light here, presumed reasonably monochrome of course, will reflect off an object here, be imaged by the lens and produce an image facet over here. Now, the demands made by that sort of regime are quite small because the rays that arrive at this image facet here come from a precisely defined angular bundle, and so therefore the limitations are really rather weak. That therefore would be a regime which would be very easy to record in the case of the Lippmann photograph, and also would be a regime which would also equally be easy to record vis-a-vis holography. Now the specular object, of course, as seen here, means that one's perception of the form of that object is itself weak. So this might typically be a very shiny object in which a casual observation of the object would lead to a very poor perception of its form. Now what holography people do is to spray the object with maybe some silicone compound or something used in the moving picture industry to reduce the specular reflectance and make the surface more diffuse. That has to be very carefully adjusted in looking at this form of imaging. But anyway, that is really the easiest regime to consider, a highly reflective object which doesn't make too many demands on the angular ray bundle that arrives in the recording medium over here. This is the next worst condition, where we have a diffuse source in which now a range of angles is involved illuminating the object, but that diffuse source now makes the object more perceptible. So we can diffuse the source a bit, make it larger, making the object more perceptible. Those people that work in holography know that what that usually does to recording of an otherwise reflective object is to make the hologram weaker, and as the degree of perception of the object goes up, so the efficiency of the hologram usually drops, and that is for reasons of complexity of the recorded fringes, as I mentioned earlier. But that case has to be considered, and what you therefore see is a greatly extended range of angular ray bundles arriving on the recording, and that means much greater demands on the wavelength bandwidth as recorded in the picture. In the small source diffuse object case, then you have a similar looking diagram. Again, a greatly extended angular range of rays arriving on the recording over here, the demands therefore being commensurately high as compared with the simple specular object and small source. When you're looking at or recording Lippmann photographs, you obviously have to consider whether you're dealing with a central image point over here or the extreme image point, and as you move away from the center of the field, well, the angular range of rays can change, and it means therefore that sometimes it may be possible to overload the recording medium in some locality, but it does mean that generally Lippmann photographs will have some changing conditions as one moves across the actual field, and that may lead to some loss of reflective efficiency. Now we start to see the links with real holography and the very interesting aspects of chromatic dispersion, which are endemic in both Lippmann's photography and in the viewing of reflection holograms. A very interesting comment was made to me last night by Jean-Marc Fournier, which is that when one looks at the holographic regime of Denis Gabor, where the object is placed in front of the recording medium with inline illumination, and one compares it with the regime of Professor Denisyuk, where the object is behind the recording medium, but again the illumination is in line. In the case of Gabor's invention, the object gets in the way of the light, producing a shadow. In the case of Professor Denisyuk's invention, in the RAW, this is simplistically, the observer's head gets in the way, because as he tries to look at the hologram, then the light is obscured by the viewer. Now, if you actually put holograms into a public exhibition, it's terribly irritating to have the illumination go out as soon as you try and look at the picture. And with Lippmann photographs, of course, it's a similar kind of demand. The picture is sitting here, and if you put your head in the way over here, you of course will shadow the direct lighting and will obscure the view of the picture from your own eyes. So you really got to try and find some ways around this problem. And I want to talk about this for a moment or two because it's quite an interesting problem. Wiener and I think Neuhaus, contemporaries of Lippmann, put a thin prism on the surface of the photograph, and the role of this prism was to take the direct lighting and deflect it away from the viewer's eyes. This is a traditionally difficult problem with any form of reflective image, that the direct view of the light source is an irritation which is quite unacceptable, so one must steer that front face reflection away. Now here, the viewer then is looking at the coloured photograph here through a dispersive element, the prism. And that can't be avoided. So if you want to actually divert the light, you have to do it with that sort of trick. But it will throw into the arena a dispersed view of the coloured photograph. Now, when you come to holograms, you don't avoid this difficulty. And the reason is this, that if you make a reflection hologram in which theoretically the fringe planes are parallel to the recording medium, inevitably in that case the viewer gets a direct view of the source of light in his eyes during replay. So this is a highly difficult problem. It means that in viewing holograms in a public place, fitting the hologram in such a way that one would get the fringe planes parallel to the surface would mean that if the light comes from overhead, it's automatically reflected horizontally straight into the viewer's eyes, and he will see an image of the source of light appearing in the middle of the image of the hologram. Now, this problem was obviously addressed by many Soviet scientists before we came on the scene. One of my students pointed out to me that if we were to tip the hologram from the bisector condition like this to something more like that, tilted at about 15 degrees, we could gradually shift the view of the light source out of the viewer's eyes until it just disappeared at the top of the hologram. Now that's what you should do, really. If you then carry on and run the hologram vertically on the wall, it may look tidy, it may be cosmetically neater, but what that does is to produce quite serious dispersion of the image in the hologram. So the tilted holographic viewing is a compromise which is analogous to the fitting of the surface reflective prism of Vina. What happens then is the hologram so designed has fringe planes which terminate on its surface. That automatically leads to a dispersive grating effect encoded in the reflection hologram. So curiously, you get the same dispersive effect looking at a Lippmann photograph with a Wiener or Neuhaus prism fitted to it, and in a reflection hologram which is properly tilted to avoid problems of viewing the light source into the viewer's eyes. So the point about this is that the off-axis hologram of Leith is obviously interesting because that attempts to take the direct lighting away from the viewer, although, of course, it throws into the arena a whole range of dispersion problems which have to be discussed, particularly in the way that's been done by Professor Benton. So in the viewing of a Lippmann photograph, one would usually attempt to have some form of diffuse source, broadband white. This shows the problem of putting the viewer's head in the way here to look at the picture, obviously unacceptable. So we could move to another geometry, and we can clearly do this trick, which is to put a beam splitter in position, having the source of light here, and observe the photograph that way. Now, that hasn't now taken care of the front face reflection of the light source. Again, we'd have to fit the Wiener prism, but at least it gets the lighting up there out of way of the viewer's head. Now I come to the point of how one actually makes Lippmann photographs. Now this is an individual viewpoint. I mean, our campaign of work here is simply dictated by our own experiences in the laboratory. We want something that actually can be made to work. The recording material is put in contact using a contact fluid with an aluminium-coated mylar layer. Mylar or terylene is a strong polymer material, and you can buy it readily in aluminium overcoated form. The emulsion layer, this is just relying on our experience, should be on film. So the base for the emulsion is again mylar or possibly triacetate. Now this seems very obvious, but what happens with this sort of regime is quite exciting. Nowadays, and I'm looking at what technology can give us for making Lippmann photographs, it's possible to overcoat the aluminium with silicon dioxide, and now it's possible to find complex silanes, which in fact will bond the gelatin of the emulsion layer, temporarily at least, to the surface of the reflector. That's one way of making a good bond by a kind of adhesive method, and these materials exist. Now what we did was a little bit more primitive. What we managed to do, this was a purely empirical discovery, we found that mylar is essentially porous to volatile organic materials. So if we had in here a volatile organic as a contacting fluid, it would after a time dry out and would evaporate through the pores of the support material. That gradually pulled the emulsion towards the mirror. Here's the mirror surface here. And eventually we were left with a minimal van der Waals contact which was very powerful. In fact, it was impossible to pull the layers apart except by peeling them off. If you tried any form of lateral shear, the strength was very considerable, indicating that if you allow enough evaporation, then the recording material and the mirror will be in intimate contact. This was a lucky find by one of my students, and it produced very good results every time, but with the requirement that you wait for about 20 minutes to half an hour until very intimate contact is achieved. That then was our method of actually making the contact between the recording material and the photograph and the mirror at the back. We also attempted the following techniques of contacting from an emulsion layer using a contact fluid onto metallized relief, and one could copy from a surface relief form of geometry into a Lippmann layer by this technique very efficiently, opening new doors in terms of generating rather specialized optical elements. Concluding this section on geometry and how we sort of set things up, these are the conclusions that we come to in terms of how best to go about advancing the technology. It seems abundantly clear now that, bearing in mind the success we had with making Lippmann layers, that a series of positive black and white masks could be used with the colors encoded in them in the conventional way. Using a white lamp, monochrome filter, and diffuser up here, we just then use a sequence of masks to put down the recording onto the recording material below. Now, of late, I've got very interested in half-tone techniques, and of course what this sort of mask technique does open the door to is something which is more novel still, which is forming the Lippmann image in dots. By using a series of chromatic masks, which are themselves a series of apertures, to produce separated colored dots, thereby avoiding the problems of overlaying the colors in terms of using the dynamic range of the recording material. But what is interesting is that, as far as I know, at least several groups are now looking at the concepts of using inkjet technology to come from swellants into the emulsion layer before recording to put dots of swelled material down. So in other words, if we had a typical inkjet device which puts down a little globule of material onto the emulsion, and we choose that carefully, possibly triethanolamine, we can cause a local swelling of the emulsion in that region, and that can be controlled in terms of a two-dimensional printing process. Now, serious efforts are now being made to produce multicolour, computer-controlled Lippmann photographs by this technique. We should see the first results emerging, I would think, probably during the coming year. This is an interesting generalization of the technique, and it takes it from being rather academic to something right at the frontiers of what imaging science today can actually produce. Most people want simple image controllability, and the concept of coming from an inkjet printer, knowing how good these devices are in terms of their normal use, in terms of reproduction of color, is an exciting development. So that completes my discussion of the regimes. Now, now we look at how the things are actually made in terms of what goes on in the solutions that are used to actually form the image. This is really the area which we found the most interest in. Typically, the planes of interference are designated by antinodal conditions, where after development, filamentary silver is created, and then the concept of making a highly reflective Lippmann layer is that one should oxidize the silver so produced by using a bleach, and then the ions of the silver created would then diffuse away from the concentrated antinodal zones, and that will produce the necessary phase modulation of the reflective layer. This is a very effective method. It's not the only method, and there is a distinguished method which was invented by Professor Benton, the intra-emulsion diffusion transfer process, in which the ions are encouraged to go in the other direction, sort of uphill, to produce a form of image enhancement. Our speciality has been to look at this type of trick to get phase modulation of the reflective layer by this sort of chemical approach. If we continue with the process, the ionic diffusion is driven by concentration gradients. The ions diffuse away, then they meet later on further halide ions, regroup to form silver bromide or silver chloride again, and then there's a regranulation effect, but you're left with more halide in these antinodal regions than you are in the nodal in these nodal regions than you are in the antinodal region here. That creates the phase modulation. Now, looking at results, this is the sort of thing we managed to achieve. With fairly routine chemical techniques, development followed by bleaching of that nature could produce reflective layers of this sort of reflectance, quite sufficient to be usable for the techniques of Lippmann photography or Lippmann holography. But with some care, with the construction of the developers, we were able to get results looking more like this, which then show huge reflectances. So this is when fully modulated, we could approach the reflectances achieved normally by the methods of using dichromated gelatin and photopolymeric substances. This from a silver halide layer. Bandwidth at half intensity of about 35 nanometers, giving reasonable purity of color in the locality. The example, which was lost in transit, unfortunately, would have showed you this in practice. But we felt that was pretty encouraging, and furthermore, if one looks at the results in more detail, we were able to determine that the shift of color between recording and replay was only of the order of 5 nanometers. So the shrinkage of the layer during this procedure was really minimal, and therefore gave a very good rendition of color between the recording and replay systems. Now, I think it's time to show you an example of that work. Our first work, which was released publicly through Agfa-Gevert in 1980, was to use the tanning developer Pyrogalol, which would leave a brown stain in the recorded material, which would be used for noise reduction, and also the tanning of the developer would hold the emulsion to a given thickness, giving a good color on replay. So if we used an argon laser to record, and we're talking now about holography, I'm going back wearing my holography hat, we'd get a green image if we recorded with a green laser. So we'll look at a piece of that early work. And that's the sort of thing that you see. Now that's a wide field reflection hologram, illuminated very badly, so you have to put up with geometry, but that's got from a very large master hologram, and that's the sort of thing which we created around 1980. And that made use of the developer Pyrogalol and the oxidation product of quinone, as the bleach. Now, I shall conclude with a further discussion of that, but I'm rather pleased that the early technology, as I say, publicized by Agfa-Gevert about 1980, has been used ever since by the American artist Larry Lieberman in Florida to produce multicolor images which are produced by pre-swelling the recording layer. So when it shrinks during processing, the color perceived on replay is different from the color which is actually used to record. These results are very interesting. They're hard work, and to be quite honest, I think this is a difficult thing to produce en masse, but his results are uniformly good, although not as rigorously created, obviously, as those of Professor Kuberta that you saw earlier. So there we see the use of pragmatic pre-swelling, and this technique again makes use of the developer pyrogalol with the bleach agent quinone, which is has a very bad track record from a toxicology point of view. What you see with this is that the presence of another colour, especially blue, heightens the perception of the three-dimensional image. And so holograms which are monochrome really have very little future when you view them against the sort of impact that these types of results have. Now, amongst my treasures, and I'll explain the differences here, are little Soviet examples, and this method of making holograms using very fine grain emulsion makes use of a very interesting trick discovered in the Soviet Union, in which the holograms are developed to produce brown silver, a colloid, very small spherical particles, in an emulsion very similar to that used by Gabriel Lippmann all that time ago. And these results are attractive because they come purely from development. The image is developed and is left at that stage, and the image is an amplitude stroke phase structure, but with exceptional noise qualities. And this type of result was I think first shown to most of us in the West at the 79 meeting in Ulyanovsk in the Soviet Union, and many of us were very impressed with this sort of technology, being unable to believe that one could make images of such low noise from a silver halide medium. After coming back from now, all these techniques relate to the basic theme. This is the production of the Lippmann photograph. I would love to show you more of the photography, but we'll have to, as I say, make do with the holography. This technique was really an answer to the Soviet threat in holography, which was posed to me by my visit to Ulyanovsk in 1979. It seemed to me there might be a hybrid technology which would combine the best of the Soviet work and the best of the work that we saw in the West. It was our assumption that, in fact, a hologram would have to be bleached to produce high levels of phase modulation, but at the same time, for consumer acceptance, it would have to have very low noise levels along the lines of those produced by the Soviet results. So we introduced this technique, and it works, but it's a bit of luck, I suppose, in which the primary development process is followed by a bleach process. At that time, we bleached into the chloride, but later we've tried the bromide. The bleach there is then reactivated photographically and is finally exposed to ultraviolet light and then redeveloped to produce a background of colloidal silver. Now, what that does is it produces a very large amount of noise suppression, but retains a very high level of diffraction efficiency. And indeed, in such a method, the signal-to-noise ratio is adjustable. One can actually mess around with the numerator or the denominator in this ratio. I'll show you a result from our laboratory at Loughborough, produced by my colleagues Donald Tompkins and Lawrence Holden, and I would hate anybody to think this is my work. It's a development of the original idea, but with all the perfection that goes into making holograms of commercial quality, be these English, American, or Russian. This hologram has been under an intense lamp in the showcase for a couple of hours, which has caused a little bit of shrinkage in the middle. It'll get back to normal later on. You can see there the very high level of diffraction efficiency, and although some scatter is perceptible, the compromise between the Soviet and Western methods is obvious. The efficiency certainly is very attractive. And in observing what actually happens to the image structure, it's our belief this has generally produced results with extremely deep holograms with very great sharp depth, which illustrates one of the difficult features of recording Lippmann structures of any kind, which is they must be uniform throughout the volume of the recording process. And I think this is just about right. So you can have a look at that later on. I'm going to have to watch the clock a little bit. Of late, we've had a bit of fun, and this is with my Swedish colleague Hans Bjelkhagen of Northwestern University, but it's relevant to this subject and will be useful to people working in the field. When we first began the work on bleached holography and extended it to the use of bleached Lippmann layers in general, we noted that one of the major developing agents of photography or holography, Lippmann photography, is the well-known developer quinol, a benzene ring with two hydroxyl groups at the end of it. What we discovered in our first experiments in the late 70s was that the oxidation product of quinol is this material quinone, which has oxygen groups on each end of the benzene ring. It's a nasty substance. It attacks the cornea of the eye and also is a bit tricky with the respiratory tract. Part of the problem, undoubtedly, is the questionable purity of the substance when it's made available. My colleague Hans Bjelkhagen spotted a couple of papers which enabled us to synthesize the quinone in unusual chemical solutions. And whereas we began by using bleach agents of this type, very simple things, but using the quinone as the basis of bleaching, then it became possible to invoke a very interesting trick. And that was using the agent potassium or sodium persulfate to note that although this is a powerful bleach agent which would be very useful for Lippmann photography or for Lippmann holography, the persulfate on its own cannot approach the ions of silver because of a double layer around the silver. So persulfate generally has to be boosted by something around it, and has in the past, especially from the work of Willems at AGFA, been added to by the use of extremely poisonous substances, onium compounds, that will ease the approach of this charged ion around through the double layer around the silver. But by actually putting developing agent into this solution here, which starts off as a bleach, the developer is then oxidized and becomes a bleach agent. So this has really opened the door to a completely new approach to development in bleaching, which have great relevance to this particular subject. In other words, something in which one sees almost complete chemical symmetry. So I will conclude by showing you this diagram here, which is rather quaint. It shows you that a subject which is as profound as this subject of Lippmann's photography also has connections in the animal kingdom in a very strange way. Now this creature, the bombardier beetle, when threatened, squirts hot quinone over the attacker, and it's produced in an orifice at the back of the body, and in that chamber there the creature feeds in quinol, developing agent, hydrogen peroxide and enzymes, and an oxidation effect of the quinol takes place, and being exothermic, the material exuded is at 100 degrees centigrade. Now it comes out in short pulses, and this apparently is very similar to the mechanism of the German V1 bomb that was fired at the UK during the last war. So maybe this is the right conclusion. Any good science has to be defense orientated. But it's an amusing concept which was found by Hans, and we've therefore concluded that natural and laboratory syntheses of new compounds for this type of work are easily possible with the techniques that we've outlined here. So to conclude this talk, I would say that the driving force for a study of Lippmann photography in our laboratory has been provided by our experiences with holography. The demands are different, but there are features in common. And of course, both methods of imagery must have a very high reflectance. They must also have a low noise level to give very high contrast to the observed image. It's very fascinating at this stage of history to look at something which happened all that time ago and realize what problems were solved in what clearly were very primitive conditions. I'm full of admiration for the great scientists of that day, Lippmann, the Lumiere brothers, people like Becquerel, who introduced bleaching. And what I think our work shows is there's always something new, and if you take the possible uses of automated computer-controlled printing, there's no reason why Lippmann photographs, with the beauty they offer, very high reflectance, the iridescent colors, shouldn't come back into common usage, but using modern technology. Thank you very much.
We have a few moments for questions for Professor Phillips. Professor Denchuk.
You invented this very famous process of chemical treatment of such holographs. And there are some other big problems in chemical treatment. Maybe it's not to develop holograms which were produced, which were recorded with the help of a very sharp or very short pulses, nanosecond, because in this region there is some clash of diffraction efficiency. There are some very complicated processes in the photographic emulsion.
Well, again,
Paraphrase your question.
yes, the question really is essentially what does one do when the recording is using very short pulses? And indeed, unless the emulsion is properly prepared or properly used, there may well be serious difficulties caused by reciprocity failure. But this sort of work, in fact, has been very extensively addressed by Hans Bjelkagen in relation to the difficult problem of using lasers for bubble chamber holography. And in a bubble chamber, if the energy of the beam is too great, the tracks of the nuclear particles are destroyed and the technique is worthless. So in Hans's CERN report, it illustrates how to, in fact, use a large amount of phenidone in the primary developer, and then very largely that work, and indeed my own work with pulse laser portraiture, shows that there's really no loss of speed and no loss of diffraction efficiency in the hologram. It's obviously emulsion dependent, but it's just tricks with the developer will actually overcome that problem.
Thank you again, Nick. I think we should take our break now, and please be back in 15 minutes because we will be addressed by the Minister of Research and Technology, Monsieur Hubert Curien. So please be back on time. Short break.
My head's always a mess.
I have to scoot, so.
Right, okay. See you later on, presumably.